This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 306, Docksal. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Docksal with Shelane French and Leonid Makarov.
You can say it Makarov. I think that's how Americans usually pronounce it. So it's
Makarov. Shelane French has been a web developer for more than 20 years, now with a passion for good interface design and user experience. She's a maintainer and co-maintainer of several Contrib modules and is a developer advocate for Docksal. Leonid is a solutions architect at FFW, a web and Drupal developer turned DevOps and infrastructure architect. He's the creator and project lead of Docksal. Welcome, both of you, to the show today, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It's going to be a fun conversation. Before we jump into it, though, I'm John Picozzi, and joining me, as usual today, is Nick Laughlin. Nick, what's going on with you, buddy?
I had an exciting weekend. So I invited up Stephen, John, and Jason for barbecue. So we had a little Talking Drupal barbecue. It's been almost 2 years since we've seen each other in person. It's always weird because I see, well, now John every week, and for a long time, Stephen every week, but in person, it was only once or twice a year. So it was a good time. Everyone brought something up. John made a fruit salad with, I gotta say, the best dressing I've ever had on a fruit salad in my life. It was a yogurt, like mint and honey dressing. Maybe we can share the recipe in the newsletter, but it was amazing. It was a good time. A lot of fun.
I was very proud of that fruit salad. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I mean, John's knife skills were impressive. I mean, there were peaches, a bunch of stuff. Peaches were sliced, like every single one was identical. I thought he bought them at a store.
That's usually good because I'm usually not that precise when cutting fruit. But yeah, there was also some limitations. There were some allergy concerns that we had to navigate. So it was fun. It was almost like building a website where you have constraints that you have to work with them.
The amount of constraints we had on this barbecue was it was definitely a puzzle to put together a menu that everybody could have. So yeah, but it was a great time. It's always good to see everybody.
And we all had fun, right? Unfortunately, Amy June's out sick today, so she will not be joining us. Hopefully, we will see Amy June next week, and we're hoping that she gets better. As for me, I'm copping out on my update just with the fact that August is going to be a really busy month for me. Had a bunch of stuff this past weekend. Obviously went to Nick's for the barbecue. Next weekend, taking like a mini family vacation. The weekend after that, doing a bachelor party for my soon to be brother-in-law. So August technically the last summer month. It's going to be pretty busy. So hopefully I can take some time to kind of dial it back and enjoy. Anyway, let's jump into our guests. And Shelane, what's going on with you?
Been busy watching some Olympics this last week and a half since it started. My 9-year-old has really enjoyed the volleyball, especially indoor volleyball. She really likes. And we've watched the softball as well since she started playing softball this last year. So Seeing something that she does done at the highest level is really exciting for her to watch. So that's been fun. My favorite, though, is the swimming. Watching especially the distance swimming. I usually had liked the shorter distances, 100 meter swims, like when Michael Phelps was in. But this year, the distance swimming was amazing, both women's and men's. I mean, Katie Ledecky just takes it down. She owns it. But to watch Bobby Fink, if you haven't caught it, watch the replay. He swims, however many lies, like 16 lengths of a pool, right? Or something crazy for the 800. And, total of 30 lengths of the pool for the 1500. And that last 50 meters, he kicks it in a gear that is above everyone else and comes from, third and fourth to kill it. And it's just fun to watch. And there's also an Olympic swimmer, Erica Brown, from my hometown. So it's really cool to see.
That's awesome. I always think it's interesting. The other day I was watching swimming. You know, again, I'm a primetime Olympic watcher, so whatever's on, I'm watching. And I just was thinking, like, these people are in the pool, they're doing their thing, right? And they just all look so uncomfortable, like as they're swimming, because they're breathing and they're like doing like the I think it was like, I don't know, the butterfly stroke or whatever. And I'm just like, wow, they just all look so uncomfortable, but they're so fast. I'm just like, it absolutely amazed me.
I saw a clip the other day that compared like one of the first Olympic swimming events to like the current Olympic swimming events. I think it was freestyle. So it's from like 80 years ago or 100 years ago. They were like 30 seconds slower. Like it looks like the Olympics back then looked like if I was in the Olympics today. Like they kind of like jumped in the pool and like paddled around, took a breath every so often, randomly would take a breath on the other side. And then the ones from today, like they were at the other side of the pool and turning around before they were like halfway. I mean, the amount of science and just like, regimen that goes into that is, I mean, it's mind blowing. I know I never could get anywhere near that level of competition in any of the sports.
We have a lab nearby for swimmers where they basically have a small pool, really small, maybe like, I don't know, 10 feet or so. And then, but it has a really strong current, and they record you from all of the angles, and they use it specifically for athletes to see how they're doing, and if they need to make any like slightest adjustments to be even faster and do even better.
Oh my God.
Is that used for like product development to develop like,
athletes, yes,
swimwear and stuff? Yeah.
Probably.
That's nuts. So Leonid, what's going on with you?
Well, it's summertime in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. Quite short, but very enjoyable. So I'm trying to get as much as possible out of it. Camping with my family, and we also took a pretty long bike trip recently with my kids and a few friends and their kids as well. It was over 20 miles long, but it was very enjoyable because we started at the mountain pass where we usually ski in winter. And it's an old railroad turned into a trail. So it's all gravel, and it actually goes through an old tunnel, which is 2 miles long under the pass. And it's really cool that the tunnel is still open, and it's used as a trail only, like the rental trains running there for many, many years. But it's so cool to just ride there, see the mountains, and then at the end of the trip, we ended at a gorgeous lake. So it was very enjoyable, and I'm really proud that all of my kids survived it, even the youngest one, who is 4. And it took us, it took us maybe like 4 hours, but we did some stops. Like Google Maps thinks it should be about 2 hours and 20 minutes or so, and there were people who were doing much faster riding there, but it's all downhill, so it's enjoyable, and
everything
cool.
With kids takes longer. You always just double it, right?
Yeah.
Did all of the kids ride bikes, even the 4-year-old?
Yes, my 4-year-old was riding a bike. There was a younger kid who was 2 years old. He was sitting in a carrier.
Yeah,
we didn't make him ride the bike.
Yeah, that was one.
Yeah,
that was
a bit
one
extreme.
Thing. A couple of years ago, we got one of those like carriers, and the kids would sit in that when they were younger, and it really got us back into biking. So that's cool. It's cool to hear that you were able to do that, and it sounds like it was awesome. That 2-mile tunnel sounds really cool.
Yeah.
So let's move on to our module of the week. So this week's module of the week is Migrate Plus. I think anybody that's ever done a migration, well, I mean, I guess that's a blanket statement, but if you've ever done a migration, you probably want to use Migrate Plus. Nick, you want to tell us a little bit about Migrate Plus?
Yeah, Migrate Plus is it's a great little module. It's a companion module. Maybe we'll do you grab Migrate Plus and Migrate Tools. Maybe this will be a joint module of the week, because I don't think I've ever used one without the other, but it basically adds some additional functionality to the core Drupal migration process. It adds a bunch of different process plugins. So things like entity lookup, entity generate, skipping on values, string replaces, a lot of things that just you really need for any slightly complicated migration whatsoever. This is the way to go. And I think the companion module adds a bunch of Drush integration so that when you're testing, you can run the Drush commands to migrate everything and roll things back and see what's going on. So if you're looking into doing a migration, definitely recommend Migrate Plus. It's a fantastic module. You kind of just install it and everything's available.
Yeah, it's super helpful. I recommend it highly if you're doing migrations. All right, let's jump into our primary topic, Docksal. That's what we're talking about today. For the listeners that may be unfamiliar with Docksal, I don't know who they are, but maybe there are a couple out there. Can we start, Shelane, with a little bit of a overview of what is Docksal?
Docksal is a local development environment for it's Docker based. It's similar to Lando, DDEV, Docker for Drupal, where everything is included for people to get started with local development for their projects. Everything they need in their stack to build locally.
Very cool. So, Leonid, one of the things that I really love learning about when we have shows about a tool like this is how did this project get started? Kind of what was the inspiration? When did you decide to open source it or provide it to the community? Because that's a massive decision, right? It's one thing to build something for yourself. It's another thing to build and maintain something for a bunch of people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, many years ago, I used to have Acquia Desktop installed on my computer, on my Mac. And then one day, start in the morning and it just crashes and I cannot do anything. I remove it entirely, I reinstall it, and it still doesn't work. And that's when I decided, well, it is the time to solve that issue and not only solve it for me, but for the whole FOW team to have a standard tool we could use across the board for all of us and be on the same page. And that's pretty much how it started. It was not the first attempt on standardization. We also tried back in the days, I think Vagrant was still in the prime time. So we had a Vagrant setup that we put together a POC for. It was okay, but Docker started to emerge back then. This was maybe like 6 years ago or so. And I made a few attempts initially with Docker. They were not successful until they introduced the volumes, so you could finally mount the file system with the host into a Docker container. And that's when the thing started to kick off. And Docker Compose, back then, it was a tool called Fig, until Docker kind of acquired them more. That also helped tremendously to kind of glue different containers together, different services, and the whole microservice architecture and approach where you are not building a monolith like Vagrant, but instead you're splitting different parts of your stack into microservices like the database, the web server, the application server, anything else that you need around your stack. So yeah, that's how it started. It really started as a library of images, which were with a Docker Compose file. And then we had a bunch of commands that had to be run to kind of initialize everything. So we started with just a simple shell script, and that eventually turned into a larger project, which we eventually open sourced. And I have to admit that today, the heart of Docksal is the fin command, which is still a giant shell script. It's probably the biggest shell script you would ever see in your life. It's about, at some point it was about like 10,000 lines of code. I think we're down to 8.5 now. Yeah, it's a giant shell script. I don't even know how it works, but apparently it works and it's pretty fast. It's actually very fast.
So you mentioned that it started out as an attempt to standardize things for FFW. And FFW being a large agency, there's a bunch of different use cases and clients. How did you kind of start with determining what containers or features were needed? So, for example, obviously you'll need a PHP one in a MySQL or MariaDB for Drupal projects. When did you start, adding other containers and services? Was it just as a team needed something, or was it you just tried to support everything right out the gate?
No, not everything right out of the gates. Back then, FFW was primarily a Drupal shop, and we were most of our clients, if not all of them, back then were hosted with Acquia. So replicating the Acquia stack was basically the goal. So you get the standard LAMP stack, plus you have Memcached and you have Varnish and Solar. So we started with just 3 containers, and then we've added Solar, Memcached, Varnish, and eventually, as Node was becoming more popular, we added, well, Node is actually part of one of the core containers in Docksal. We don't use a standalone container for that. But then we added like Elasticsearch, Redis to support the Pantheon stack. I think it was evolving mostly around hosting providers that we were using to mimic their environments as close as possible for local development. So that's Acquia, Pantheon, then we added Platform SH. And those 3 are still the providers that we currently create stacks for. We also have like stacks for like single page applications and all the applications, but it's still primarily Drupal, WordPress, PHP-based stacks. But as it is Docker and Docker Compose based, there's nothing that prevents you from adding anything you want in there. And Docksal operates primarily at the Docker Compose level, so we don't introduce any additional abstraction layers. So we try to keep it as slim and as straightforward as possible. If you know Docker, if you know Docker Compose, you can just jump in and extend Docksal with any other services that you would need. You can even replace the entire core stack with your own stack if you want to.
Very cool.
And is Docksal the kind of the default development environment at FFW, or is it kind of like an option for, if you're a developer, you could use Docksal, but you could use something else if you wanted to?
It is the default. In cases where it's not, it was likely enforced by the previous team when we inherit the project, or when we work as part of the client's team and they had another process already set up. It's also standard for the FFW US in Europe, because FFW is so big in Europe. There are other teams that they may standardize on other tools, so there is no enforcement across the globe for that. But we've recently done a survey, and I think over 90% was using Docksal on the teams, and not using, preferring, which kind of highly correlates with using. And only one respondent replied with like, "Oh, I like to do everything myself, like just local OS packages. If I have to deploy to production, I would just use a virtual private server." So old school.
Oh man, I don't know who would want to do it that way, but hey, to each his or her own. Just to give our listeners a better understanding, what differentiates? So truth be told, I'm a Lando user, but like, what differentiates Docksal from other dev tools like Lando or DDev? Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, we try to be as slim as possible in terms of abstractions. So it's mostly Docker Compose. If you are familiar with that, you will feel at home with Docksal. Historically, we've also tried to be inclusive of the host systems. So we try to always have feature parity and kind of first-class citizenship for Linux, Mac, and Windows. Historically, we've also started with VirtualBox back in the days when boot to Docker was kind of the primary option to run Docker on your Mac or Windows. And we still support that option. A few years ago, it was pretty important when Docker Desktop on Windows switched to using Hyper-V as the underlying hypervisor. And that thing would not allow you to run any other virtual machines. So you can run Hyper-V with VirtualBox at the same time. And for users on projects where they have to use still have to use Vagrant, that was a big bummer. And with Docksal, they were able to switch to the VirtualBox mode and kind of use both Vagrant and Docksal projects at the same time using VirtualBox. And of course, we do support Docker Desktop as the primary underlying engine for Mac and Windows users now. Unlike Lando, for instance, I know Mike doesn't want to maintain any of the images. Docksal is also a library of images that we maintain. I would also love to get rid of that responsibility eventually as the official local library matures and there are more images and they become more and more flexible. I think we would still have a few core services that we would maintain, like the virtual host proxy. Lando, I think, uses traffic, if I'm not mistaken. And we have our custom Nginx-based virtual host proxy with some really cool features that I use in a sandbox setup. And sandbox is another cool feature in Docksal, which is not really used in local development environments, but we use this in our continuous integration. So we have a sandbox server where we basically have Docksal installed as well. And we provision feature branch environments there. So whenever you commit something into Git, it automatically gets deployed onto the sandbox server. And then the cool feature that's built into the host proxy is managing the resources of that server. So it automatically stops or puts the inactive project stacks into hibernation. And whenever a request comes in to an existing hibernating stack, it will wake it up. So this way we can provision very moderate servers which can handle lots of projects, but not concurrently, because we manage resources in a smart way, and we only kind of run active projects when someone really uses them.
So I want to step back for a second, because you mentioned that Docksal maintains its own library, which is, as you said, a different approach than what Lando does. I'm curious about that process and how much of your time is spent updating and maintaining those. And one of the reasons why I asked that is, I don't know if you know this, but I worked on building a analog to Docksal Lando and local development environments maybe 4 years ago, called D for DD, or maybe it's 3 years. It was right around when Docker for Drupal came out.
I think pretty much everyone tried it back in the days.
Yeah, and I was in the process of like standardizing it when there was an explosion out there, and I was like, well, there's 4 or 5 other tools. There's no need for me to finish this. Let me try a bunch. So yeah. I'm curious how much of your time is spent maintaining that library, and what does that process look like?
Yeah, sometimes too much. Well, we do have repos for every image that we maintain, and we do have automated tests for the major images. What it looks like, well, whenever there is an update in functionality that we once introduced in Docksal that requires a change to the image, we do that. If there is like a new PHP version coming out, we create a new version of the image. And now we have to figure out, well, how to make everything that would bundle with Docksal work with PHP 8. And we've just made a release of the PHP-based images, and there were quite a few challenges there. And now the ARM64 M1 apocalypse coming on us, having to now make all of the images compatible with ARM64. That's a lot of work, I can tell you. It probably, in the last year, most of the time went into upgrading those images and the infrastructure related to building those images across multiple architectures and testing them. I think eventually we may be able to replace some of the secondary images. Like, I think we don't really maintain a varnish image. We just use a standard image. Same for Redis. Solar, we still have custom images, but I think we've been using some of the WOTB images, or kind of starting from the WOTB images. But yeah, some of the core images we would still continue to maintain. And one of them is the CLI image, which is kind of our PHP image, the heart of the stack, where we bundle all of the CLI tools. And that's also one of the difference with, let's say, Lando. I think Mike likes to keep all of the tools like in their own images and kind of attaching them to the stack whenever you want to use like Drush or Composer. In our case, we take an old school approach where we have a service in the stack, which we call the CLI service, which runs PHP FPM, but it is your CLI terminal environment where all of your tools that you would ever need for web development are pre-installed.
And we are looking at ways of automating the updating of those tools, kind of like on the Dependabot level for, node packages or whatever. We want to look at any way that we can to automate anything. So we're looking into some of those now, but right now I'm just subscribed to everything that we have. So I get notified anytime that there's an update to like Acquia CLI or Composer or some of the other tools that we have bundled into our CLI image, and then just get those continually updated until we release a full version. That way, when we release it, all those tools are up to date.
Kind of circling back to the original question and talking about, differentiating Docksal from others. Shelane, I'm interested, you have, over 20 years of experience with the web. Interested in understanding why you chose Docksal over some of the other options out there.
Well, I'll tell you the story. So in 2016, I worked with, we had some consultants come in to help us with our Drupal project. And so I worked with a guy from Genuine, and Les Peabody, if anybody on the East Coast knows him. And he's just got a brilliant mind. And so I kept in touch with him after that project. And I reached out to him and said, hey, do you have an hour to talk to me? Because we're about to start our Drupal 8 project. And I was having trouble with Acquia Dev Desktop, as Leonid was even talking about. That was what we had locally, but I'm just like, it's just not going to be what we need going forward. I know I need something else. And so I had a conversation with him and he told me about Docksal, and he had done a presentation on it at Nerd Summit shortly before that. So I even pulled up that video and watched that afterwards. And I didn't really have a DevOps kind of a mind before this. I just didn't focus on that area. And I suddenly got excited about DevOps and what that meant and being able to automate processes. And they had set up for us, Les had set up for us Thing in our previous project, but every time we had to add another step, it was really complicated syntax, a big XML page, and I wanted something to just automate those processes of starting up. Anytime you needed to update our code base, do all the steps that you need to with Drupal and do them all in the right order, and so all those needed to be automated among my team, and to have a stack that would be the same across the team without having to maintain our own stacks. And so I just got really excited about it. And I just started reading everything I could. And I read the blog that they had. They had a few videos at the time. And then I started down a road I didn't think I would. I started writing bash scripts. And even though they say you can write custom commands in any language that's in the processor, so you could write them in PHP or Python or something else, but bash was the example scripts that were used. And it looked pretty easy for all the stuff that we needed to do, setting up the local settings files and running Drush, since you have to run a lot of Drush steps. And so when I was doing that, it just clicked for me. And I got more and more involved. I read literally every page in the documentation, including Windows. And I'm not a Windows user, never have been. And I started contributing changes to the documentation, some updates, wording, simple things. And as I started using it, I just loved it. And so I even started writing blog posts, and then just got involved into the project itself.
So I'm curious then, because you mentioned you're automating some things, and Leonid had mentioned setting up kind of a staging server or feature branch server at FFW. Did you end up, do you use Docksal in that same way too, or do you use it only for like local development?
Right now, only local development. We're working on getting, we have Jenkins internally. So we're working at getting that set up, since there's not a lot of documentation on the web in general for Jenkins. And I'm not really a Jenkins or a Java person. If anybody knows, Jenkins pipelines is written in Groovy, a Java language. And so trying to get through the intricacies of those steps, but I want to actually be using a lot of those same steps, those same automation steps that we're doing with Docksal. So we're trying to get that set up actually this summer. And I'm sure there'll be a really good blog post about it when we're done.
One of the key mantras with Docksal that I always keep in my mind is you have to be able to clone the project repo and then run a single command and get everything you need out of it, the infrastructure for the project, including the whole like files and database, like the whole application up and running. And that's the idea behind the kind of one of the key, not the primary commands, custom commands in Docksal, which we call init. Essentially, it's another bash script, but as Shelane mentioned, you can write it in anything. And the idea is that you clone the repo, run thin init, and that initializes the stack, which is the primary responsibility of Docksal. Just going to start the Docker Compose project. But then it's users' responsibility to put together a bunch of other steps that would pull like the files, the database, run rush commands, database updates, and all that stuff. And we have examples for different projects, different tools from Drupal to WordPress to what else do we have? Backdrop and other CMSs for how that can be done.
So one of the things I'm also curious about actually is whether or not Docksal conflicts with other Docker-based tools. So for example, like John, I'm also a fairly heavy Lendo user. I do run some stuff in Docker manually as well, but most of my workflow for web stuff is Lendo at the moment. And I know that DDev and Lendo sometimes don't play nicely together. They both try to kind of take over the proxying, I think, or take over. They just don't play nicely together. Does Docksal have the same kind of conflict, or can you run them side by side if you wanted to evaluate both of them?
It will be true for any web server or any tool that tries to utilize a port that another tool wants to utilize. And with web, we have two standard ports, 80 and 443. So if your tool tries to use a port locally and another tool is already using it, then yeah, you would have a conflict. So it's nothing new, nothing special, but yeah, if two tools try to bind to the same network endpoint, there will be conflict. And back in the days, we tried to be very cautious about how we're doing this, how we're handling this in Docksal. And Docksal actually maintains a canonical IP address that we attach to the local interface on all of the systems. And we used to bind specifically to the IP and port on that interface or to the port on that IP. And this way, if your other tools are nice and they don't try to bind to like the wildcard interface, like all IPs, then they can coexist together, because then you may have like your 127, 001 IP address for like, let's say Apache or Daisy, and then Docksal would be on another endpoint with another IP, but the same port, and that could work. But a few years ago, Docker Desktop or maybe Docker Engine, they were introducing a breaking change after another breaking change, and we just had to basically deprecate that approach, which was really working until those breaking changes came down to us, and I think we had to basically also just bind to a wildcard. And yeah, now if you want to use, let's say Lando and Docksal together, they use the same ports, you would have to stop one tool before you start the other tool, or you have to reassign the ports. And I think we do support this. Like if you do want to run them concurrently, just tell them to use different ports, and they run in containers. There are no other conflicts whatsoever.
Leonid, we talked about your involvement, obviously, in this, like from the beginning, right? it was a need for FFW, and you kind of worked to develop this. Shelane, I'm interested when you got involved and became the developer advocate for Docksal.
Yeah, as I mentioned, it was when we started using it. We started building our Drupal 8 project in early 2018. Okay. And so Docksal had been around for a little while. And after I started making, pull requests for documentation, I also started making pull requests for the Drupal. We have a bunch of boilerplate projects that make it easy for people to start up a new project. So as Leonid mentioned, there's, WordPress, Laravel, we have Angular or straight up Node project or straight up Symfony project. So we have several boilerplates that are just Git repos under the Docksal project. And some of them, like we have a Drupal 8, that's just Drupal 8 code. And then there's Drupal 8 Composer. And then we have Drupal 7 that is not Composer based at all. And as updates come out, we want to make sure that our boilerplates have the latest code as well. And those, they don't take a lot of time to update, but they do take some time. So I just looked at it as a way I could contribute to the project to take some of that maintenance time away from the lead maintainers, and started saying, hey, I raised my hand. I'll help update these repos for you. I'll keep them updated. And at least that would take some of that maintenance level off of them. It's not that it takes a lot of time, it's just the repetitive time. And then more people that are involved that take a little bit of that time off, make it easier for the maintainers to work on it. So I've been doing that for a few years now.
So is there a Drupal 9 boilerplate, or
yes,
do you just use the Drupal 8?
There's Drupal 9. And as well as a BLT based one from the Acquia BLT project. Yep. And the recommended Composer project as well. We have that. So if Drupal 9 comes out, we'll be ready with the Drupal 9 boilerplate as well. Drupal 10, when it's released next June, hopefully, then we'll have that boilerplate out as well. And especially for security updates, those definitely I want to, make sure that they stay up to date. Just because anybody who's starting up a brand new project from our boilerplates, I don't want them to start up behind.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think this question probably is a little bit more towards you, Leonid. Another question I'd like to ask for projects like this is kind of what's your development process? So, it's one thing to have a tool for yourself that you use and then you update something and it breaks, and it's kind of small. When you have something like Docksal where, tons and tons of people are using it, and as you said, kind of the main master bash script, like the big bash script is 10,000, 8,000 lines or something. It's no longer something that you can just jump in and tweak something. So when you're preparing a release or testing a release or testing a new feature, what does that look like for you? How do you make sure that you're not breaking something for tons of people when you're releasing a change?
Yeah, so we, as I mentioned, we do have automated tests. We do have them for the primary Docksal repos, so we're testing the primary use cases that people would utilize within, like creating project stack or any other commands. We also have tests for images. They're much lighter, just to make sure that there is not like a broken binary that's somehow got, well, not downloaded. There was a broken link, and now the binary is not really a binary, but for a page instead. Those run. We utilize GitHub Actions. We used Travis for many years until it's basically fell apart. And now we are still in the process of migrating to GitHub Actions. And we do run automated tests on every commit. And I also, well, in my dreams, we have a CI environment where we can test Macs and Windows as well, but that gets very complicated. So those have to be tested manually. Macs are easier because I think pretty much all of us maintainers are using Macs. So we basically tested ourselves. And I also deploy a pre-release on the FFW sandbox server just to see if anything will break there. And Windows is the most difficult to support. We don't have any Windows maintainers. And I have a, VMware Fusion on my Mac with a bunch of virtual machines that I would also just kind of test there before releasing anything. Just the standard use cases, like running some of those boilerplate projects, making sure that they do initialize correctly and everything works. That's how it looks.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's always one thing to maintain a couple of tools or scripts for yourself, but once other people are using that or other companies are using that, it's a different level of
we had to invest into this automated testing infrastructure time primarily to write those tests early on. Because when you work with such a large tool and covering so many use cases, there is no way you can, like, I used to test them manually, but it started to become very daunting, and it has to be automated. So
how many people are using Docksal at the moment? Do you know? Do you have any metrics on that?
We collect basic statistics. I would not be able to tell you like what kind of projects people run, what kind of stacks, but we know what versions of Docksal are out in the wild and what operating systems are used. Right now, I think we're at about 3.5 thousand monthly active users.
Wow.
Yeah, something about that. And that only counts local setups. There might be more like sandbox service instances. I've provisioned myself maybe around 5 for our clients where we're not allowed to use a shared instance of the server. So, and I know Lass is also using a sandbox server, Genuine. So about 3.5 thousand users that show up in our stats.
That's pretty cool. I have another question for you guys. So regular listeners of the show will know I'm a huge fan of Docker. I don't use Docker just for Drupal development, but my home server uses Docker, and that's where like all my home automation stuff runs, and probably about 24 other services. So I'm curious if either of you, maybe we can start with you, Shelane. I'm curious if either of you use Docker outside of Docksal and development, and if you do, what do you use it for?
I don't. Currently, I know that there are a lot of other projects at the lab where the lab, there are only 20 national labs or something, but we call it the lab. There are other projects that people do development with Docker, but just my team, no, we just use Docksal for Drupal development now.
Okay, very cool. How about you, Leonid? Do you use Docker?
A lot of use cases for Docker. Yeah, I fell in love with Docker early on, and that's how Docksal was born, out of that love, I should say. Let's see. Sometimes I use Docker locally as a replacement for a binary. So I basically put together an alias for something that runs inside of a container, but I invoke it as a standard binary, for instance. Which has everything prepackaged what it needs inside of that container. That's a pretty cool use case that I really like. And then outside of my local environment, we're now in the process of, on a project, like on my real client work that I do outside of Docksal, we are moving towards hosting in a Kubernetes environment and migrating. Like we build a lot of micro apps and microservices, which there is Drupal there, but there are a lot of Node.js and React applications, and all of that is containerized, and we are deploying that into Google Cloud, into Cloud Run, which is a managed Knative for anyone familiar with the Kubernetes world or universe. And then we also have right now a non-production cluster where we are deploying those applications. So it's
very cool.
It's pretty wild. Yeah. Like outside of local environments, there is real production hosting that's already happening out there with Kubernetes.
So
Very cool.
Following through on other uses for Docker and Docksal, where do you both think Docksal's going? Do you have a roadmap? And if so, what's on that roadmap for the future?
Yeah, well, Docksal we thought about commercializing it at many points in time, but it requires a lot of effort to even put together a plan and then to promote it. I think for now, it would stay as a local development environment toolkit, as well as the kind of sandboxing tool, which we never advertise for sandboxes part, but I think we should do a better job there. As for the roadmap, as I mentioned, ARM64 M1 support is hot on the lists. We have more people now buying those M1 Macs and realizing they cannot really do anything with them for web development specifically, if it's like Docker based. We also want to improve the support of Windows subsystem for Linux version 2 on Windows. That was also up in the air for quite some time, and I just need to get some time to get to that after we're done with this M1 madness. I've just discussed yesterday with Les a pretty cool use case that we already supported, but we will extend it for cloud development environments. And I know it's also like pretty much everyone is trying to solve this now, where you have some kind of container or a bunch of containers running in the cloud, and then you have like a VS Code server or something else like a cloud ID in a browser. And you just access it from your browser, and everything is there for you, your code base, your terminal, and you don't even need anything at all installed on your local, not even Docker. So it's your machine becomes a thin client connecting to a web server where you get your cloud ID and everything. And we've been discussing with Les yesterday, PHP Storm, which we primarily use at FRW for web developments. They have recently introduced a project called Projector, which is pretty much VS Code, like the VS Code server. Like it's a web-based PHP Storm interface. It's a PHP Storm in a browser, essentially.
Oh, I need to tell you, one of the Docker containers that I run is a VS Code container running on my home server, so that when I need to edit the configuration, I just go to the address and everything's there. So it sounds like a similar kind of.
Yeah, it is awesome. And the reason why it's also awesome, and I think we will try to, maybe that would become the primary way you interact with your development environment. And the reason for that is it's the most performant way that you would ever get out of a Mac or Windows machine. Because like with the problem with file system performance and shared file systems is not new. It existed from the days of Vagrant and before, and no one was able to solve it. And maybe we just have to flip it on its head and just keep everything inside of the container, even the code base.
I have to say there is a and that solution is Linux.
Yeah.
So the cloud-based solution sounds like a roundabout way of saying we use Linux through a Mac.
If you
just use
listen to the
Linux?
show regularly, we always come back to Linux at some point.
I was looking for a way to bring this up, but I didn't want to.
No, and that is true. The only difference or nuance there is how do you access the Linux? Is it through an SSH connection? Is it a VNC connection, like a remote desktop something connection, or is it web browser? Web browser is just another interface how you access it.
Or is it native on your computer? And then you also save the thousands of dollars of licensing from Apple.
that is true. But
this has been a fascinating conversation. One thing, and Shelane, because I think you've been doing a lot more of the documentation, it sounds like recently, I'd be really interested to hear, what is it like to get started in Docksal? Do you have to install Docker beforehand? Do you just have to download a script? Like, how do you get started? If somebody's looking to try out Docksal, what's the best way to get started?
It's pretty easy steps for new users. Yes, you have to have either Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows. If you're running on Windows, I can't talk too much about the Windows side, but on the Mac side, we say install Docker for Mac to run it natively. VirtualBox, you said, still is supported, correct? There's that option. Our team, we just tell them in the instructions, if we're onboarding somebody, install Docker for Mac. There's a one-line code to install Docksal onto the computer. It downloads everything that's needed. And then as soon as they pull our repo or any repo, or even just you're talking to a new user pulling a project, they can just run fin project create, and that pulls up a wizard to say, what project you want to start from, a boilerplate project that we already have, or maybe your own Git repo that you have a project existing out there. But if you start from a boilerplate, say, okay, I want a new Drupal 9 composer based, and you select that number, then it will pull that Git repo from ours. It will start everything up on a fin init command, and you're good to go. Should be under 15 minutes. You should be ready to roll.
Very cool. So as I said, it's been great having you both on. Thank you for reaching out, Shelane. If anybody wants to learn more about Docksal, I think the documentation is at Docksal, DOCKSAL.io. And if you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You can join us on the Talking Drupal channel on the Drupal Slack, or email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can get show updates by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron.
In this episode, if you're a patron, you're going to get the raw feed, and that's going to include me getting upset about wet track and field conditions. So, there's some incentive to sign up. So thank you both again for joining us. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you think is super important that we should bring up before we close out the show here?
I would like to mention that for any open source project, it's powered by volunteers, and Docksal is the same. If you are hesitant to contribute, but you want to, we have a contributions guideline, and just reach out to us on Slack and the Drupal Slack. There's a Docksal channel. We also have a Gitter. Just ask what can be done, and so we'll be very happy to get you started and help you contribute. And if you feel like you don't have enough time, we've opened the Docker GitHub sponsorship program for Docksal as well. So that is always an option and would be much appreciated to help us support our infrastructure and things like maybe buying a real M1 machine that we can test on for all of the Mac users out there.
Awesome. Leonid, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you to talk more about Docksal or just ask questions in general, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, we have the Gitter chat link in the repo and on the website. We also have presence in the Drupal Slack. There is a Docksal channel. And if you want to reach out to me directly, it's leonid@docksal.io. Just email me.
Perfect. Shelane, how about you?
You can find me at Shelane on Twitter or Shelane in the Drupal Slack.
Cool. Nick, how about you?
You can reach me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And if you are interested in EPAM, you can find out more about us at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.